I am Thomas, and we are headed to New Brunswick, New Jersey, where we will be discussing an unsolved true crime case all the way from 1922. And this involves Edward Wheeler Hall, an Episcopal church priest, and Eleanor Mills, a member of his choir. There is the picture of Priest Wheeler Hall and Miss Mills, who was a member of his choir. And they were alleged to have an affair. And both of them were murdered on September 14th, 1922, in nearby Somerset, New Jersey. This case was a very high profile case back then in 1922. In and around that time, especially in New Jersey, just a few years later, you would have the Lindbergh case with Charles Lindbergh and his baby, which would probably top this case. But this case, in and around the United States, was given the label of being a media circus, just due to the fact of this case being widely profiled in newspapers nationwide. The extent of the coverage of this case was pretty extensive. I would probably, just to get an idea, probably to like the O.J. Simpson case, the Casey Anthony case that we see now in most recent modern times. A very high-profile case back then. In September of 1922, and here is just a solo picture of Miss Mills, the bodies of Eleanor Mills and Edward Hall, they were discovered in a field near a farm in Somerset County, New Jersey. Now, according to police reports, both bodies were on their backs. Both had been shot in the head with a .32 caliber pistol. The man once, and the woman, she was shot 3 times. The bullet entered the man's head over his right ear and exited through the back of his neck. Now, the woman was shot under the right eye, over the right temple, and over the right ear. A police officer at the scene noticed that the woman's throat had been severed and maggots were already in the wound, indicating that the death occurred at least 24 hours earlier. As we're approaching modern New Brunswick now. The bodies appear to have been positioned side by side after their death. Both had their feet pointing toward a crab apple tree. The man had a hat covering his face, and his calling card, his business card, was placed at his feet. Torn up love letters were placed between the bodies. Here is a kind of a reenactment that the police did of how the bodies were found. Now, during this time, when the word got out that there was a death, a lot of people that were curious, they went into the onto the death scene. They took souvenirs. One of them was Hall's calling card. It was stolen and kind of dispersed between the crowd there, that onlookers. So the physical evidence was severely compromised in this case. Here is the parish that Mr. Priest Hall Wheeler was part of. Modern day, how it looks like now. This is in New Brunswick, right nearby Rutgers University, very close by. Very quiet, looking church. Not a loud quote unquote church. Just very quaint and quiet. The woman was identified as Eleanor Mills. She was the wife of James Mills. And here is how she was found and where, the bullets went and how her throat was cut in a diagram used as police evidence. She was wearing a blue dress with red polka dots, black silk stockings, and brown shoes. She had worn a blue velvet hat that was on the ground near her body, and her brown silk scarf was wrapped around her throat. Now, her arm had a bruise and there was a tiny cut on her lip. Her left hand had been positioned to touch the man's right thigh. And the man again was Edward Wheeler Hall. And he was positioned with his right arm to touch the woman's neck. His hat covered his face, which concealed a gunshot wound to his head. He wore a pair of glasses. There was a small bruise on the tip of his ear, and abrasions were found on his left little finger and right index finger. His gold watch was missing, and there were coins in his pocket. Now, the suspects, right from the beginning, as you can imagine, would kind of in a case of who done it. The suspects were Hall's wife, her two brothers, and a cousin. Now, the investigation yielded no indictments, continued speculation, fueled by comments made by a man associated with one of Mrs. Hall's housekeepers. Mrs. Hall, the wife of Edward Hall, the priest. So those comments led to, kind of open up a second investigation that was ordered by the governor, and then a trial in 1926. Now, one of the individuals here is the wife of Miss Priest Hall. One of the suspects, his name was Henry Carpenter, won a bid to be tried separately from the three others accused. And while, ultimately he was never tried. The trial began in 1926. It lasted about 30 days, and again, huge national coverage, media circus, so to speak, as this is downtown New Brunswick, modern downtown New Brunswick. We will be heading to the final resting spot of Miss Mills in a matter of moments. The prosecution's key witness in this case was Jane Gibson. Now, Jane Gibson was a pig farmer on whose property the bodies were discovered. The defense portrayed Gibson as being uneducated and crazy and attempted to ruin her credibility. Now, Gibson's account varied, differing when told to the police, to newspapers, and at the trial. So her story was all over the map, all over the place. At which she testified from a hospital bed rolled into the courtroom. Modern Who done it? All three defendants at the trial were acquitted. Miss Hall and her two brothers had the motive and the means for murder, but there was not enough evidence to convict them. So some of the suspects, you look at Henry Carpenter. Henry was a cousin of Frances Stevens Hall and her brothers, whose mother was a carpenter. He had worked as a Wall Street stockbroker. Although he was an initial suspect, he was never brought to the trial. You have Frances Noel Stevens Hall. She was the priest's wife. In the prosecution scenario, she instigated the murder of her cheating husband. Turned out not to be the case. In later years, her home was bought out by Rutgers University and used as the residence of the dean. She, Miss Hall, was related to many wealthy families of New Brunswick, and it was even said that she might have been possibly related to the Johnsons of Johnson and Johnson. That's right, that Johnson. Band-Aids, Johnson and Johnson. You had Henry Stevens. Henry Stevens, he's a retired exhibition marksman. The prosecution contended that he fired the shots. Now, Henry, he testified that he was fishing miles and miles away from the murder of the night of the killing, and 3 witnesses had corroborated his testimony. You had William Stevens. He owned a .32 caliber pistol, like the one used in the murder, although the firing mechanism was supposed to have been filed down so that he could not hurt himself with it. In the prosecution scenario, he provided the weapon, and his fingerprint was found on a calling card left at the scene of the crime. Now, Willie was a colorful character on the witness stand, delivering credible and not unsympathetic testimony. He was incapable of holding a job, and he spent most of his time hanging out at a local firehouse. Now, his eccentric personality was consistent with high-functioning autism. But at that time, the condition had not been yet clinically described, and no conclusive diagnosis could be made. Now, back to the witness, Jane Gibson. Remember the pig farmer? She said that there were 4 people that were standing near a crab apple tree. She heard gunshots at that point, and one of the figures fell to the floor, presumably dead. She testified that a woman screamed, "Don't!" Now, apparently that woman said it 3 times. She said that she turned her mule in the opposite direction and headed back to her house. At that point, she heard 3 more gunshots. When she looked back at the tree, she saw a second person fall, presumably dead. She testified also at the time that she heard a woman shout the name Henry. This was the trial that everyone had their eyes and ears glued to. Very sad story. The people that murdered Mr. Hall, Wheeler Hall, and Miss Mills have never been found. I hope their souls rest in peace.